Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title up there, it's time for something a little bit different. I'm going to be talking about a series of books and films that I've known about for nigh on 20 years, but it was only within the last couple that I actually started delving into it a little bit. First through the form of videos on YouTube, and then of course actually listening to the audiobooks and watching the film adaptations. The theatrical film adaptations, I might want to put that thing. I have yet to watch the two miniseries that were done off of the first three books. That, of course, is Frank Herbert's Dune series. Now, the ones that were written by Herbert himself, it consists of 6 books. We have Dune, the one that has the most adaptations, with 3. Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, which those 2 were adapted into the second miniseries. And then we have the latter 3, God Emperor Dune, which is the audiobook I'm currently on, Heretics of Dune, and Chapter House Dune, which is the last one that he wrote. And after that we got the prequels written by his son Brian and Kevin J. Anderson, which a lot of people seem to have a lot of mixed opinions about those, whether they're good or bad or not. And given how many have been published over the last 20 years, I can see why. I mean, just looking at it, we got the Prelude to Dunes ones, which are about the different houses, the jihad and all that. Then you got some of the sequel ones. So it's a lot. It's very confusing. Now, this series is going to be this video series, I should put, is going to be split into a couple parts. This first part is going to be an overview along with my overall thoughts on the book series that I've gone through thus far, and whether I think it's worth going through. Because I think if anything, I could probably do a more in-depth video on each individual book later down the road. Probably a lot like how I did for the different entries in the Dark Tower series for Stephen King and other books I've reviewed off and on. And then there'll be individual reviews for the theatrical film, starting of course with Lynch's and then going into part 1 and then part 2 when it hits theaters. Now, to start off, how exactly did I learn about this series? It's one that I kind of learned about first through cultural osmosis, because Dune is one of those series that even if you've never read it, you've heard about it through either low references or more blatant ones. And of course, through osmosis is the fact it is undoubtedly one of the inspirations for Star Wars. Now, there's the whole thing with Lucas reading The Hero with a Thousand Faces and that whole thing there, but there are little references in Star Wars, the original trilogy, that you're like, yeah, he at least has some familiarity with Dune, even if it's through the same one. Of course, you know, desert planet, hero going on a hero's journey, but whereas Paul's is a little bit different, more a little bit dark, and kind of a little bit more realistic when you think about it, Luke's is more straightforward with the hero's journey narrative. Not to say that's bad, it's just, you can tell that's where the influence on that part ends. And then of course there being a drug called spice, whereas spice in Dune is a very big plot element. Depending on what part of the series you're in, I guess you could say it's kind of a MacGuffin. Whereas the spice in Star Wars, it doesn't really become an important part of the plot until a couple later entries in the expanded universe, both in Legends and in canon. Like, even though my Legends knowledge isn't absolute, the first time I remember it actually coming up as a plot element that is more direct and not just backstory is the first part of the Jedi Academy trilogy, where Han and Chewbacca go to Kessel and actually get trapped. And then of course it kind of is important in the Solo film, considering that actually shows how and why in the canon series of events Solo made the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs, even though, as they put it in Family Guy, is parsec a distance of measure of distance, not time? Well, yeah, it is, but the reason you say that is because you actually found a shorter route. Now, of course, there's other references, like Iron Maiden wrote a song off of one of their 80s albums called To Tame a Land that is based off of Dune, and that's actually what they wanted to call it, but being the nice gentlemen they are, they asked Frank Herbert for permission to call it Dune, and his agent sent back that Mr. Herbert does not like rock bands, especially rock bands like Iron Maiden, so if you call it that, we will sue. Which, over the title, I'm a little surprised they threatened that, but not over the fact that the song references stuff from it. I mean, you have words like Caladan, Arrakis, Gamjabar, and other references to the story in the song, and yet you don't sue over that. I think it's just Herbert just being the typical old man that yells at clouds at that point. Now, even with all this, and of course knowing about the two adaptations at that time, the Lynch one and then the miniseries one, and having seen clips, I just never got around to reading it, and I never got around to watching it. Then a couple years ago, as I was delving into the audiobook thing, and I learned that they were doing another adaptation of it, I'm like, maybe I should get around to actually reading these books and actually watching the movie. I mean, I had the original Lynch film, the original bare bones Blu-ray release in my collection at that point, and since then I have acquired the special edition one they did not that long ago. And because of the fact that the new one is directed by Dennis, and I'm probably gonna butcher his last name, I'm just gonna say Dennis V, because I'm not even gonna try butchering the pronunciation without having it in my notes. A director who I do have a lot of admiration and respect for, just based on one of his films that I had seen, and that of course being Blade Runner 2049, his previous film. And of course, another one of his films, Prisoners, was one of my favorite films of 2013, if not my favorite film. So I knew that the series was in good hands just from that, but I'm like, yep, before I see it, I might as well familiarize myself with it a bit more. So I listened to the audiobook, and I did enjoy it. Now this audiobook, the only thing that's a little weird, especially for a first-time listener, is it goes back and forth between different actors doing the narration and lines for the characters, and just a single person, like a typical audiobook, doing it. So that can be a bit jarring, but I will say that they choose the right chapters in order to do that with. Like chapters where the villain is scheming, they have a different person voicing the character, so there it makes a little sense. And of course after that I had to listen to the sequels. It took a little bit of a while for me to get around to them, because I wanted to watch the films first before I got into there. But they did it, and you can definitely tell with the sci-fi influence and why there's a lot of cultural osmosis with it. And the best way to describe the Dune series, if you've never seen it, even if you haven't never seen the films and you haven't read the books, is it's if you were to take a little bit of the sci-fi world, like in Star Wars, with a little bit of Star Trek, because it's a little bit more of a realistic take and not a space opera take, and combine it with Game of Thrones, mainly the political machinations, backstabbing, and the different houses vying for control. So basically it's like Game of Thrones set in space. And being a fan of both Game of Thrones and space stuff like Star Wars and Star Trek, that is a good thing, at least how I look at it. Now there's other sci-fi stuff I know set in space, like 40K and all that. Not being familiar with those, I can't say like if that's a better comparison to try to say like, hey, if you like this, it's like this. But getting into that, just so you know, there is going to be a lot of political backstabbing and all that in it. Not to say that's a bad thing or whatnot, but it definitely makes the story stakes a lot higher. Now, the first book, now there, if you haven't seen either of the theatrical films, there's going to be slight spoilers in this discussion part, but the first film deals with the main house, which is House Atreides, which is the house that the main character Paul goes to. That's Timothée Chalamet's character in the more recent film. His family is given control of Arrakis, which is known as Dune because it's a desert planet. And they know it's a trap, or at least Paul's father knows it's a trap, but he's going anywhere because of the power it could give them, and also to try to prevent any negative things from happening to them. He feels that he can. Now, the whole reason they're given that is because of this thing called the Landsrat. It's like a congress of all the different political houses, even though the emperor is, the emperor, he's the supreme overlord of the whole known universe, as it were. He is still beholden to the Landsrat. So in a way, he's kind of like a constitutional monarch without being a constitutional monarch. He has power, but it ebbs and flows depending on how strong he is and the will of the lens rat. And of course how much money is moved around, and of course how well the spice is flowing. Because spice is an important commodity in this future because it is essentially a drug that allows humans to travel through the stars. And this delves into some of the backstory of it, but that was because of something called the Butlerian Jihad. Butlerian Jihad. Where there was a whole war involving machines that had, if not human consciousness, they were designed to be thinking like humans. So imagine like very powerful AI, like stuff we see in Terminator, Brainiac, and stuff like that. But because of this jihad, they have made a rule that thou shalt not make a machine in the image of a human mind. And because of that, they have to devise other ways in order to travel throughout the stars. Because, as Han Solo put it in Star Wars, flying through hyperspace ain't like dusting crops, boy. You go too close to a star, too close to a supernova, you're not going to have a good day out in space. So instead of that, they use the spice in order to increase their mental faculties, to give them a form of ESP. They're espers in that case. And of course, the ones who do all this, the spice also mutates them a little bit. We don't see him in the book or in the new adaptation, but of course in the original Lynch film we see one of these spice navigators, and in the sequels we see them. They're still human-like, but they're not human. Because how they travel through it using the powers, it's hard to tell what it may mean by folding space or whatnot. But it allows them to travel through the stars, and of course because of that, spice is expensive, and space travel by extension is also expensive. And so the whole Landsrat thing at this point, though, to tie it all back to the main plot, Paul's father, Leto Atreides I, is very popular in the Landsrat at that point. The Emperor essentially is jealous, and he's trying to prevent any negative thing from going on. Partially because of the fact of all the different marriage alliances and all that have happened over thousands of years, and especially the more recent ones. A lot of these houses are related to one another. Now, off the top of my head, I don't remember how related House Atreides is to House Carino, which is the house that the Emperor Shaddam IV belongs to. But as some we're going to find out, technically it is pretty related to their arch enemy, House Harkonnen, which is where the Baron belongs to. Well, I'm not going to get into it in that video, but let's just say there is there. Now that's probably more something to talk about when I actually get to talking about the plot in the movies, or down the road when I actually do this in more in depth. But there is that. He fears that there could be that threat. Now in the book, this is more revealed later on as the plot goes, whereas in the first theatrical movie, a lot of this is set up in the introduction scene, which, whether you like that or not, is going to depend on, I guess, on how you view that film, but we'll wait and talk about that when we get to David Lynch's film. Now, the Harkonnens and the Emperor attack House Atreides and massacre them. A lot of their guards are killed. Several of the people manage to escape, like Gurney. Several of the people are taken into the Harkonnen service. Paul and his mother, Lady Jessica, manage to escape, and they blend in and start living with the local people, the Fremen. They are really based on Islamic culture, even though they're not all supposed to be Islamic based. I mean, not like how we would typically imagine Islamic characters. Like, even though it's not mentioned until a later book, Paul's love interest, Chani, has red hair. Now, I don't know that much about Middle Eastern culture and all that when it comes to that, but I can't really think of that many in the Middle East who have natural red hair. But correct me if I'm wrong on that in the comment section below. That seems to me more like it's a result of humans going into the stars after thousands of years, and a lot of these different mutations and different genetic things that we humans have, blue eyes, red hair, just becoming more prominent. Not to say the blue eyes among the Fremen is from that. It's from their consumption and being near spice, which I know some of you are probably going, he hasn't even mentioned the big thing about that yet, and that, of course, is the sandworms. And this is where we get that. Sandworms, even though it's one of those things that, like, yeah, just take the worms, make them bigger, and put them in the dirt. It seems like a big thing, but this seems to be the thing that a lot of those spun from. I mean, Beetlejuice had sandworms. Technically, the graboids are sandworms, so you could say there's some cultural osmosis there, but that could also just be happenstance, but I gotta bring it up. Of course, the sandworms here, they're very, very dangerous. And it's also what makes spice harvesting very expensive and dangerous, because you gotta be careful for the sandworms. And at the beginning of the story, they don't realize what, but not to go too far into it, but the worms are involved in the production of spice because they're the ones that create it. How, I'm not going to go into here since this is just an overview video, but they're the ones who do it. Now, I'm going to sum up a lot here, but Paul, along with the Fremen, he does start doing guerrilla warfare against the Harkonnens, and eventually they attack the Harkonnens when the Emperor visits, and Paul takes over. He kills the Harkonnen heir after the Baron is killed, of course, and he essentially forces the Emperor to abdicate, and he marries his daughter. And that is how that part of the story ends. Now, Dune Messiah picks up years later, where Paul is the Emperor. A lot of his Fremen have left Arrakis and are now doing a jihad in his name. And this is kind of in the more recent definition of jihad, where they're basically going around killing people indiscriminately. Because technically jihad just means struggle, so I guess you could still call it that for the Fremen, but they're doing it in the name of Paul because they see him as their Messiah, hence the thing here. Now, the books go into a lot of thing about implanting prophecies, prophecy not being what it means, which of course is why I say the Game of Thrones influence there, and bring it up with Star Wars, a prophecy misread, perhaps? And to go in with the whole thing of ESP, Paul has seen prescient visions of the future, and he's trying to steer humanity in the right direction for the right outcome, which of course, like a lot of the best Greek tragedies, sometimes you end up going down the road you wanted to avoid by trying to avoid it. And of course, one of the things, though, that Paul just can't bring himself to do is to make a certain sacrifice in order to make sure that humanity ends up on the right path. He knows what path that is, but he can't do it. Now, there's a lot of political machinations with the houses wanting to try to overthrow Paul, put House Carino back on the throne, get some little inner turmoil with Paul's wife, the Princess Irulan, and of course his real love, Chani. There's a whole thing there about offspring and heirs for it. And of course, in the end, Paul does get children. And that leads into the next one, Children of Dune, which deals more with his children growing up, them coming into their powers, and the whole thing about what happens if you're born with these powers at too young an age and you are aware of them. The dangers of that. And we see that a lot in the first one, but then with this next one it becomes a lot more prevalent, and especially in the form of Paul's sister, Ganima, if I remember her name right. Which I haven't mentioned her at all, but she's a minor character in the first one, creepy. She becomes a little bit more involved in the second one, but this is the one where she really comes into the forefront and where we really see the danger of having that type of power at that age, because part of it, when you have a certain aspect of this power, is that you have access to the knowledge and memories of your ancestors, which in certain circumstances could be bad, because if it's a personality that is particularly strong, they can overpower your personality and take control. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, that House Atreides is related to House Harkonnen. That comes into play, and its negative results for Ganima. That's all I'm going to say about that. Now, unlike his father, Paul's son of the twins, Leto II, manages to make that sacrifice, which essentially involves him transforming himself into a human-worm hybrid. Which of course leads into the one I'm on, God Emperor of Dune, where it's centuries later. Leto is still alive because of the fact that he is a human-worm hybrid. He is essentially steering humanity towards his master plan. And just so far that I'm in the book, you can really see he's going towards his master plan. He knows a lot more than he's letting on with certain people, especially his close confidants, one being a Guller clone of Duncan, Idaho, who was Paul's, one of his teachers and close confidant, who has been cloned before. Well, I mean, the first time we see him cloned, he is Ganima's consort, and then Leto just took a liking to it and decided to have Duncan cloned over and over again to be his guard, and in this part of the book we're seeing his more recent iteration cloned as his guard. And then of course there's Marino, who is one of Leto's descendants through his sister. And just based on some of the dialogue, it seems to me that Leto has a fondness for his many times nieces and nephews, even if some of the stuff that he sees is like, that could be a threat. But is it, or is it just part of his plan all along? That's what it seems to me. And just reading the spoilers for the book, it seems like it is, because in the end, even though Leto does meet his demise, spoiler there, his plan does come to fruition in essentially allowing his descendants to escape being observed by ESP powers. And the next couple ones involve humanity spreading across the stars, the return of the sandworms to Arrakis, because by the time the events of God Emperor, Arrakis has been terraformed extremely, and without all the desert, there's not really much place for the sandworms to go. And of course we got, there's not really much else to talk about with the next two ones, other than the fact that Chapter House ended with a cliffhanger, and of course Herbert died the following year, so several of the plot lines he introduced there were unresolved, which of course led to his son Brian with the two sequels, Hunters of Dune and Sandworms of Dune, which were based in part on notes that Frank left behind. So I think that's why, just from what I understand, out of all of them, they seem to be the least egregious out of all of them. And then there's also that little thing at the end of the book where we get two characters that seem to be based off Frank and his wife, which, that's a nice little thing there. Nice little cute thing. I don't know, there's not really much else to talk about here without going into the film adaptations too much. I guess the main things to talk about is that the first film adaptation, Lynch's film from the 80s, it heavily abridges the plot of the first book in order to get everything in the 2-ish hour time frame, and without going back and revisiting it. I did enjoy it, but if you want an extremely faithful adaptation of the book, is it probably not for you, because it's essentially the book's greatest hit moments. And if you don't really like the other part of it, then probably not for you. But I did enjoy it. I mean, like the score, the special effects, even though some people lambast some of the worm ones, but for an 80s one, it works, and especially with Lynch's trippier directing style. He's definitely the right person for this type of film with how trippy the whole thing involving the spice and its effects on the mind are. Which that alone is how you can tell that the original Dune was a book that was written and published in the 60s. That whole thing right there. And of course the more recent one, it adapts the book a lot more faithfully, to the point that the first movie ends with Paul and his mother joining the Fremen, so the second one is going to be mainly the war and a lot of the other stuff involving Dune that spurs from that. There's only one other thing to mention when it comes to this background without delving into, and that is that before Lynch there was another director who almost got around to making one. And I'm just going to give the shorthand with all this, because if I ever get around to watching the now 11-year-old documentary they did about this, that of course would be Jodorowsky's Dune. Alejandro Jodorowsky, known for films like The Holy Mountain, a film that I reviewed a couple years ago after watching it in that film class. Of course this one delves into that, how in the 70s he almost made one because they got the rights in the mid-70s. Herbert met with him. Other people that were involved in this film were Salvador Dali, Orson Welles, Mick Jagger. They were involved in some form or another, but the people who were involved with it majorly were, of course, H.R. Geiger. I'm waiting to see if you guys can tell me the other name. I have it. Dan O'Bannon. And why are those two names important? because those are two people who were involved in the creation and production of the 1977 classic Alien. Of course, Geiger did the special effects and designed the alien. Of course, Dan O'Bannon was the original writer, and while his original script wasn't the one that was made into the film, he was still involved in the process. And of course, they talk about this film in that documentary on the Alien, the Blu-ray and DVD, but only in passing, because that's how they met, because it's not something you go into a lot. But it would have been interesting to see Dune with the special effects done by them, with Geiger involved. Oh, it would have been trippy. People would probably might be complaining about it more than they complain about the Lynch one, depending on how Jodorowsky did certain choices, but it would have been a trip to watch. Of course, the film fell through. A lot of stuff just reading it here, but that's something I'll talk about if I ever do get around to watching this documentary. But it was after the film rights lapsed in the early 80s that's when De Laurentiis stepped in. Of course, we get the Lynch film. Now, when it comes to the miniseries on TV, there's not much to say other than that, just from the bits and pieces I've seen, for a TV miniseries, I'm sorry to see, it doesn't look bad. Some of the special effects, you look at it and go, eh. But TV miniseries, especially late 90s, early 2000s, you take that into account, it's not that bad. I can see why it was praised for a miniseries at the time it came out. One of these days I will probably get around to watching it, but it's the second part that I'm not looking forward to, because I hear that one is a lot worse, mainly because of how it abridges the first half, the first book that it goes into, even though that book is already small as it is. It's like a bridging book in between Dune and Children of Dune. I mean, it's a trilogy, so you got to have a bridge in there somewhere, even though of the two trilogies, the second one was written closer together. God Emperor Dune 81, Chapter House 85, with the original one Dune was 65, Messiah 69, and Children 76. So you got that whole 10-year period. But part of that was because originally they were serialized, so you got to take that into consideration. All in all, as from how I've gushed about it, the Dune series does come with my recommendation. If you're not really much of a reader, you can always go the route I have gone and just go to Audible. Like, see, there's my thing right there. That's how far I am. I still got about 9 hours left in that one. And of course, it's a good way to get through it. Now, when it comes to Herbert's word choices, it's not like with, say, someone like Lovecraft, where like seems like every other sentence you got to bring out the thesaurus to understand what he's saying because of the adjectives. He writes simply complex, if that makes any sense. His word choices don't make you scratch your brain to understand what he's saying, both from how he words it and what words he uses. It's what he's writing about, the political machinations, the whole trippy nature of the worms and the spice. That's where the complexity comes about. His storytelling, his world building, that's where the complexity comes in. And to be honest, that's probably my favorite type of writing when it comes to that, is when you can be complex without coming across as overly pretentious. And that's really all I have to say. So next time, we're going to be delving into David Lynch's film from the 80s. And we'll be talking about, like, well, with this rewatch, does it hold up? And we'll be talking a little bit about the backstory when it comes to that film. And why, sadly, Lynch, it seems to be the only thing he's made that he just does not want to talk about. Until then, everybody. And may the spice flow.